Jai Srila Prabhupada. There are two kinds of transmigration of a living entity after passing away from the present body. One kind of transmigration is to go to the controller of sinful activities, who is known as Yamaraj. And the other is to go to the higher planets up to Vaikuntha. Here Lord Kapila describes how persons engaged in activities of sense gratification to maintain a family are treated by the messengers of Yamaraj called Yamadutas. At the time of death, the Yamadutas become the custodians of those persons who have strongly gratified their senses. They take charge of the dying man and take him to the planet where Yamaraj resides. The conditions there are described in the following verses. Thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purport. So these are verses spoken by Lord Kapila to his mother. And we have been seeing how a conditioned soul who is attached to sense gratification and all his life absorbed in just maintaining the family and working for their sense gratification and his own sense gratification, how he gets old and becomes weak and diseased and not able to speak, surrounded by family members who are also lamenting about his condition. And finally, he dies. That's the verse that we are seeing today. And what he experiences, Yamadutau tada praptau. At that time, the Yamadutas arrive. And how are the Yamadutas? Are they very friendly? Are they very nice, welcoming him or such things? No. Bhimau. They are terrible to look at. Sarabhasa ikshano. And their eyes are full of anger. They're very angry that he was such a sinful man. And this conditioned soul, sadrishtva, and he sees that Bhimau, Sarabhasa ikshano, Yamadutao, two of them have arrived. And his heart is full of fear. Trasta hridayaha. And in that state, Shakran mutram vimunchati. He passes urine and stew. And he leaves this body. So, very graphic description of the last moments of a conditioned soul. Just to remind us, just to caution us that we shouldn't follow this path. There is a higher and a much better path for our lives. And that's the purpose of Srimad Bhagavatam. That is the purpose of Kapila Deva's description of all this. And so he is saying here, at death, he sees the messengers of the Lord of Death come before him. Yamadutau tada praptau. Their eyes full of wrath, sarabhasekshana, and in great fear, trasta hridayaha, he passes stool and urine. Shakran mutram vimunchati. So Srila Prabhupada has nicely explained here that this kind of a passing away of this living soul from this body, there are two kinds. Transmigration. Prabhupada used this very nice word in English, to migrate from one body, tata dehantara praptihi, as transmigration of the living entity from one body to another body. And there are two kinds. Sometimes the living entity can go down to lower planetary systems, as this particular soul, conditioned soul's description is. that he was meeting Yamaraj, who's going to take him to Yamadutas, who's going to take him to Yamaraj. And what those conditions of those planets in where Yamaduta is going to take are the next few verses. We will be seeing very detailed description of the different kinds of hellish planets. On the other hand, it could be another kind of a transmigration where the soul moves to higher planetary systems and to the highest planetary system, Vaikuntha Loka. And in the case of a sinful soul, those who have acted sinfully, Yamadutas take charge of that soul. And those who have acted devotionally, Vishnudutas take charge of those souls. So it's left to us how we want to act and what will be the result. And one of the interesting things that we must notice is that when Srila Prabhupada presented Krishna consciousness all over the world, and when he came across these kind of descriptions in the Vedic literatures like Srimad Bhagavatam or other places in the Gita, Prabhupada gave direct meanings of these things. Yes, there are Yamadutas, and if one has acted sinfully, they come and take charge of that soul. And how are the Yamadutas? They are Bhimo, Sarapasekshano. They are terrible to look at. Their eyes are full of anger. This is how the Yamadutas are. Because we can see here Kapila Deva explaining so many things all along, so many verses. Very philosophical, very thought-provoking, making us to think seriously about life. Is this the way one has to lead a life? Makes us think philosophically. So very philosophical, thought-provoking, very intelligent, wise descriptions are there. And suddenly Kapila Deva is saying, now at the time of death, Yamadutas come and they are terrible to look at. So what Mayavadis and modern interpreters or misinterpreters of Vedic literature, what they do is that they say, oh, now fiction begins. So far it was facts and now it's all fiction. Why would Kapila Deva do that? So far he is speaking so wise statements. Suddenly it does not become imaginary, mythological, myth. This is how Mayavadis present Vedic literatures. None of these are modern interpreters, modern Mayavadis. Even Shankaracharya never said this. Even he accepted that, yes, Yamadutas, these are all descriptions in the Vedic literatures. This is what happens. Very respectful to the scriptures and scriptural descriptions. But modern day Mayavadis, modern day interpreters in our country, they say that no, this is just some imaginary stories just to convey some idea, to create some fear in the weak-minded people. Those kind of things they say. It's not true. So far, Kapila Deva is speaking very wisely. And he should continue to speak wisely. He will continue to speak wisely. Not that he will switch over to some kind of a fictitious description. That is not the way Acharyas have explained the Vedic literatures. So we have to be careful. Tadvignanartham sagurumeva abhigachat. This is the principle in the Vedic literature, that if we have to understand this knowledge, we must go to a realized guru. Shrotriyam Brahman Samit Panihi Shrotriyam Brahmanishtam. He should be Brahmanishta. He should have heard this knowledge from his guru. He should be coming in a parampara. Then we will understand Vijnanartham. We will be able to correctly and accurately understand this knowledge. So, now in the current 21st century, with all the science and technology, all of that, how do we understand that there are Yamadutas and they will come and they look terrible? How can we understand and how can we explain this? There are some very interesting things that science has discovered last few decades. And scientists have been trying to explain various phenomena, and suddenly some scientists came across when they were actually trying to solve some other problem in physics, quantum mechanics, they came across another kind of an interesting development. Initially, the scientists were actually very surprised to hear about this development, but then later on, more and more scientists begin to accept this kind of an understanding. That is, the understanding about space dimensions. At least this gives an opportunity for us to think about it. So, like for instance, we perceive three-dimensional space. Remember, in our younger days, we did two-dimensional geometry. X and Y axis only was there. We had triangles, circles, and such squares, rectangles. And then at some point, we were introduced to a three-dimensional geometry. Spheres, cubes, and such things. So we see that you can move left and right. This is one dimension. You can move back and front and back. That's another dimension the space has. And one more dimension is that you can go up and down. So these are the three dimensions which are represented in geometry as X, Y, and Z axis. Scientists begin to question this idea. Why is it that the space we see has only three dimensions? Why was it not just two-dimensional? In fact, one novelist, one writer wrote a book, and that book he called it was a fiction, and he called it Flat Land. And in that, all characters were in two dimensions. They lived in a flat world. They never had any idea of height and depth and such things. So, and the whole story revolves about characters in flat land, and they're called flatlanders. And so, to just move on their whole world is flat. Like we have a world which is three-dimensional. They had a world which was flat. There was romance, there was, crying and all kinds of things happening in the flatlanders' world. And later on it was made into an animated film also about flatlanders. So, why is it that we are familiar with three dimensions? Three-dimensional world is what we experience. It could be two-dimensional, it could have been. And are there higher dimensions of space? So I'll read out a few paragraphs. This is written by one of the scientists who was involved in the discovery of higher dimension in space. A brilliant scientist from one of the reputed universities in America. And so this scientist writes, no physical theory we know of dictates that there should be only 3 dimensions of space. Because there's no theory in science which says that there should be only 3 dimensions. It just happens to be the 3-dimensional space that we see. Why is it? Are there higher dimensions? Now let's see what the scientists say. Although we cannot see them with our eyes, see them referring to extra dimensions in space. Although we cannot see them with our eyes or feel them with our fingers, additional dimensions of space are a logical possibility. First of all, the argument is about, I'm just taking some different paragraphs from a big article here and there. So it's not full article by itself. So scientists now agree that there is a logical possibility that there could be higher dimensions. Our senses register only 3 large dimensions. So an infinite extra dimension might sound incredible. But an infinite unseen dimension is one of the bizarre possibilities for what might exist in the cosmos. So actually scientists say that not just 4th dimension, 5th dimension, an infinite dimensions could be coexisting in this space. It's just that our senses can register only 3 large dimensions. We are not just physiologically designed to process more than 3 dimensions of space. See, now scientists are talking about how our senses are made. We are physiologically, the eyes we have and the space and the sense of touch that we have, all our senses are designed to process only 3 dimensions. Maybe there are higher dimensions, but our senses cannot process them. Another paragraph. We could be living in a 3-dimensional pocket of space, even though the rest of the universe behaves as if it is higher dimensional. This result opens a host of new possibilities for the fabric of space-time, which could consist of distinct regions, each appearing to contain a different number of dimensions. We might just be living in an isolated neighborhood with 3 spatial dimensions that's part of higher dimensional cosmos. So scientists are actually beginning to think that there could be other areas in the universe, or both kinds of thinking is there, that there are higher dimensions even here, but our senses and physiologically we are not designed. We cannot make out, we cannot feel them, we cannot see them. Scientists use tools like mathematical tools to describe and understand and postulate various kinds of, to solve various kinds of scientific problems. And they have found that bringing in additional spatial dimensions solves a lot of mysteries and puzzles that scientists are actually engaged with. And finally, this scientist says, goes on to argue about this, and then, do I believe in extra dimensions? I confess I do. So, this is the kind of thinking that exists, that so very clearly from our Vedic literatures, as Srila Prabhupada explains, Karana Apatava. This is one of the 4 defects of the living entity: Brahma, Pramada, Vipralipsa, and Karana Apatava. Karana Apatava. Karana means instruments, or here it means instruments of knowledge, and it refers to the senses. Karana Apatava means insufficiency or inadeptness or imperfection of senses. So, Karana, Brahma, Pramada, Vipralipsa, Karana Apatava. Arsha Vigna Vakya Naiye Dosha. This is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's words. Arsha Vigna. Arsha means realized souls. Those great sages who have realized transcendental knowledge. Arsha Vigna Vakya. And their Vakya, their words of wisdom. Vigna Vakya. Vigna Vakya means enlightened words. Enlightened words of whom? Arsha, who are transcendentally realized. Arsha Vigna Vakya Ei Doshanai. These 4 defects: Brahma, Pramada, mistakes, subject to illusion; Vipralipsa, cheating propensity, Prabhupada explained. Because the conditioned soul in this material world, who wants to enjoy, that enjoying propensity is so deep. And when the conditioned soul interacts with the other living entities in the material world, actually he is not thoroughly honest. He is an opportunist, just trying to get every occasion to maximize pleasure and enjoyment for oneself. And so he goes on to cheat and delude himself, make mistakes, subject to illusion, and still think that I am a very enlightened person, very wise person, and so on. So that is why very strongly we say that what our senses, what our mind, what our intelligence can actually understand is a very, very limited aspect of the reality. It is limited aspect of the material reality. What to speak of something which is higher. That is why it is said, Prabhupada explains, there are 4 levels of knowledge, or 4 levels of awareness of the living entity. The first level is the level of pratyaksha jnana or prakata jnana, what is manifested and what we see. That is pratyaksha. Our eyes can see, senses can see, pratyaksha. And there is something higher than that. Actually, the pratyaksha also is divided into 2 kinds. One is called vyakta, another is called avyakta. Avyakta means that is not manifest. The material energy remains in an unmanifest state sometimes and comes into manifestation and then again goes into a non-manifest state. So this kind of a alternating stages of manifest and unmanifest, vyakta, avyakta, keeps happening in the material world. So this is all prakata or pratyaksha jagat. And we may have knowledge about that. That is called pratyaksha jnana. And there is something beyond this. Parastasmattu bhavonyo vyakto vyaktat sanatana. Parastasmattu bhava anyaha. Anyaha bhavaha paraha. There is another existence which is transcendental to this, and that is also divided into 3 stages. One is called Paroksha Jnana. Paroksha Jnana is when we just begin to understand something that is non-material, and that is Brahma Jnana. Then when we understand a little bit more about transcendent Brahma Jnana, then we begin to see that yes, in Brahma Jnana also there are variegatedness, there is personality, there is a spiritual world, and that is known as Adhokshaja Jnana. And that refers to Vaikuntha Jnana, Vaikuntha awareness and perception of Vaikuntha world. And even higher than that is known as Aprakata Jnana, which is knowledge about Krishna Loka. So there is Pratyaksha, there is Paroksha, there is Adhokshaja, and Aprakata Jnana. So our consciousness, we can elevate our consciousness. Right now our consciousness is at the stage of Pratyaksha or Prakata Jnana alone. So we see things, bodies, human bodies, vehicles and houses and interactions and this. This is what we are familiar with. But actually, as human beings, through spiritual processes, we can elevate our consciousness to become conscious of higher and higher things. So, scientists also acknowledge that there are many more things about this material world our eyes cannot see, our senses cannot see. So Yamadutas and Yamaraj and Yamadutas and Swargaloka, that's actually part of this material world only. It is also Pratyaksha Jagat, but you need higher qualifications to be able to perceive that. Depending on our qualifications, we are given senses which can perceive various degrees of Pratyaksha world, Prakata world. Just like an ant also has senses and can see certain things. But ants' level of knowledge is, suppose there's an ant crawling in this room here, there could be many ants, and they also have some knowledge, but their level of knowledge is, are they conscious that we are discussing transcendental knowledge from the Bhagavatam here? They cannot understand. They're not conscious of any of those. But this is a fact. We are sitting here, we are discussing Bhagavatam, an ant could be crawling, but the ant is, in his level of knowledge, level of consciousness is looking for some sugar crystal or some hole to go inside and be safe. So that's the level of knowledge and consciousness of an ant. And as human beings, we have come to a higher level. We are conscious of the ant, and we are conscious of things more than what the ant is conscious of. So we are at relatively a higher stage. But there are many more stages of material knowledge which we may not be aware. So this is the kind of a perspective that Srila Prabhupada presented, which is the perspective given in the Vedic literatures. Prabhupada did not make any compromises. He wanted to present these truths as it is. That's the beauty of Srila Prabhupada's presentation. In that sense, when we say Srila Prabhupada is a true ambassador, he took this knowledge as it is and presented. Another important thing is that he not only presented it as it is, he presented it with tremendous conviction. Devotees experienced seeing Prabhupada, they would say that when you see Srila Prabhupada closely and when you talk to him and you hear him, all your doubts about existence of God would go away. You would be convinced. That's the kind of a conviction, Shraddha, Prauda Shraddha, Vedic literatures describe. Very, very profound, very deep and mature Shraddha effuses from the transcendental personality of a pure devotee. So that was the kind of a personality Srila Prabhupada was. And when he carried this knowledge, when he went around sharing this knowledge, teaching this knowledge to people around the world, he would touch the hearts of people by that conviction. Not just knowledge, but that conviction. Once it is said that Srila Prabhupada called all the GBCs. This was very early, 1972 in Los Angeles. And then he called all the GBCs. It was a meeting with the GBCs. And then Prabhupada was very sober, very grave, very intense. And then he asked them, do you believe Krishna is God? Are you all convinced that Krishna is God? And he looked at each one of them, one after another. There were probably about 8 or 10, maybe 10 GBCs at that time. And very intense, and everyone was silent. Prabhupada was making them to go into their own hearts and see whether they are convinced about this. Are you convinced about this? So I'll read a small section where one of the GBCs who were present there recalls this. Los Angeles, 1972. Prabhupada had all the GBC men come to Los Angeles, where some of them took sannyas, and we discussed reapportioning preaching zones. We had one special meeting with Srila Prabhupada that stands out in our memory. All the GBC men were sitting there in the room, and Prabhupada looked us all over. He said, are you all convinced? We just sat there. Nobody said anything for about 2 minutes. It was one of the heaviest moments of my life. Prabhupada challenging us, are you convinced? Are you sincere? As Prabhupada spoke, his GBC disciples listened intently. As far as I am concerned, he said, I am convinced. Therefore, I am pushing on. It is a fact. I am pushing on because it is a fact, not fiction. That much I am personally convinced. So actually we should also reflect. We are talking about Krishna. Are we convinced that Krishna is a fact or it is some fiction? Yamaduta, Yamaraj, and all this is some fiction that Bhagavatam describes. Krishna was born, he did this, he played on the flute. Is this fiction or is this a fact? And Srila Prabhupada saying here that how that he is fully convinced and hence he is pushing on this. Another occasion Prabhupada says, unless you are convinced about it, you cannot help me in my mission. In other words, he wanted this kind of a transformation to come about in us and to carry that conviction, bring about that perception. Continuing reading. Whenever, that much I am personally convinced. Whenever someone says, you believe, Prabhupada is saying, whenever someone says, you believe, I say, no, I do not believe. It is a fact. So Prabhupada is saying that it is not just a belief. Belief is very relative, you see. Some of us can believe one thing. Someone else can have some other belief. Varieties of beliefs are possible. So it's Krishna and Krishna's, the truth about Krishna, the existence of Krishna, as Prabhupada is presenting, is not a matter of belief. A few people in India and a few people now around the world believe Krishna is God, and there are many people who don't believe, and that's also okay. No, it is not. It is a fact. It is a matter of fact. So whenever someone says, you believe, I say, no, I do not believe. It is a fact. So you must spread your conviction by your literature, arguments, preaching, facing opposing elements. But are you convinced? If you are not convinced, then it is not good for me. The first thing is enthusiasm. Don't be dead. You have to work more than me. Anyone who has life, he can preach. This is how Srila Prabhupada addressed that small group of GBC members very early in 1972. So, there are many occasions where Prabhupada would ask this question. Are you convinced? Do you believe? Do you accept this? Are you convinced about it? Innumerable times. And sometimes he would very feelingly ask, are you convinced? During morning walks, during classes, during informal room conversations. So, there was another disciple of Srila Prabhupada. He was of Iranian origin, but he had studied very well. He went to Harvard Business School. And later on, Srila Prabhupada in 1976, he had made him a GBC. So he recalls, and in fact he writes in 1983 a Vyasa Puja offering. I'll just read that small offering. My dear Srila Prabhupada, time and again you spent numerous hours explaining this sublime philosophy of Krishna consciousness to me. See, actually, this is what Prabhupada would do. Even if there was one person, Prabhupada would be very enthusiastic, would be very happy to explain the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. And he would again and again explain. He would never be tired. He would be so happy to describe Krishna philosophy. So he's saying, time and time again, you spent numerous hours. In fact, Prabhupada would say, to change a person, one has to give gallons of blood to convert one person into a devotee. Actually, it is a fact. To transform a person, we come with all kinds of ideas, and then we, little by little, we hear, and then we develop conviction about Prabhupada, then we develop conviction about parampara knowledge. Then all the other wrong things that we have heard, we start re-evaluating, and then reading the scriptures and developing confidence about the scriptural knowledge. Because we have heard so many things, in this material world. Apparently good values of this world, like say freedom fight of our country, the history. We hear about all those kind of things and the freedom fighters who are celebrated, leaders in our country historically. So we hear about that and then we start evaluating all of that in the light of transcendental knowledge. Isn't it? That has happened to all of us. And then we all come with a lot of scientific conviction. And then in the light of transcendental knowledge, we start understanding, that all that science is just at one level of existence, the prakata world. There are many more other aspects which our senses can't perceive. So gradually to bring somebody to the level of understanding and developing that confidence that Krishna is the Supreme God, that is another big thing. Because as Hindus, we have heard so many gods, and we all were worshipping different gods in our homes, family, as in our younger days. Then gradually to understand and to develop. Then at one stage we get a fear. No, if I accept Krishna is God, then other gods I was worshipping, will they become angry? Right? We all have gone through those kind of stages of internal deliberation. It happens. So finally coming to the understanding about who is the Supreme Personality of God. And then we hear in Chaitanya tradition that no, not even Vishnu. Krishna is the Adi Purusha. And even Vishnu is coming from Krishna. And the avatars are all coming from Krishna. Oh, that's another paradigm change. Because as Hindus we have heard about Dashavatara, 10 avatars of Vishnu and all these kind of things. So one after another, layers and layers of misconceptions with Srila Prabhupada's knowledge, the knowledge that Prabhupada has given with his association, and gradually we shed those and come to the understanding about Krishna. And Prabhupada during his life personally was doing that again and again and again with many, many devotees. And that's what this devotee is recalling. Time and time again you spent numerous hours explaining this sublime philosophy of Krishna consciousness to me. He's describing his own situation. And time again you turned to me like a mother begging of her naughty child. Are you convinced? Do you now appreciate that this Krishna consciousness is the highest philosophy? In my youth and arrogance, I kept quiet with doubtful eyes. He's reflecting on that. So, you see, and time again, you turn to me like a mother begging of her naughty child. Are you convinced? Do you now appreciate that this Krishna consciousness is the highest philosophy? See, sometimes when we read Prabhupada's books, we may not be able to capture the mood in which Prabhupada is saying that. So sometimes devotees, when we hear this, we understand like a mother begging of her naughty child. So that was the mood in which Prabhupada was asking, are you convinced? Do you now appreciate that this Krishna consciousness is the highest philosophy? That's why Prabhupada says in the Bhagavad Gita, there is not only knowledge, there is a certain spirit of the knowledge. And in parampara that is passed on. How did Arjuna take it? How was Krishna speaking this knowledge? He was speaking with a certain sense of urgency, a certain concern for Arjuna. And it was an intimate conversation. It was only two of them speaking. Arjuna later on reflects this. When Krishna has left this world and he comes back and meets Yudhishthira, there is a verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Evam chintayato jishno Krishna pada saroruham sauhardena tigadena chintosi shantosi amalamat vimalamatihi. Arjuna is reflecting on that. With great intimacy, he spoke this knowledge to me. So it was an intimate talk between the Lord and a devotee, an intimate talk between the Lord and a devotee in a friendly relation, sakha. Bhakto sime sakha cheti rahasyam hetuduttamam. I'm going to tell you the rahasya. I'm going to tell you the most confidential thing. Please listen carefully. I'm again going to, you see these kind of expressions in the Bhagavad Gita. So, sauhardena atigadhena. Atigadhena means with deep. Sauhardya means with a deep intimacy of friendship. He spoke. Prabhupada gives a class on this verse in Los Angeles. And 8 times he says in that class, not only Krishna and Arjuna had a deep and intimate relationship, Every living entity has a deep and intimate relationship with the Lord. Each one of us have an intimate relationship with the Lord. This is the revelation of the Bhagavatam. This is the revelation of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy. Deep and intimate. Intimate means very... Right now, what is the intimate relationship we experience? Maybe with our father, mother, maybe with children, some of those who have children, wife, and some friends maybe. All of this is on an ephemeral platform. This is not experience of reality. Real intimate relation each one of us have with Krishna. Are we experiencing that? Once Prabhupada was asked, what is a yogi experience? Prabhupada said, yogi experience, a true yogi experiences ecstasy. Always ecstasy. So, a state of constant ecstasy. So, that was the kind of devotion Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was presenting. That is why his method is singing and dancing. You see how Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is represented? Arms raised and dancing. Ecstatic devotion. That is the natural perfection, highest level of perfection every living entity can potentially attain. That is what Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was teaching. So he says, the devotee is recalling, and time again you turn to me like a mother begging of her naughty child. Are you convinced? Do you now appreciate that this Krishna consciousness is the highest philosophy? In my youth and arrogance, I kept quiet with doubtful eyes. And then Prabhupada went to Tehran to meet this. He was the GBC. He went twice. Prabhupada went to Iran twice. And then he is recalling that. And then in Tehran, in the car of Daulat, you turned to me and boldly stated, I have come here just to save you. I traveled here to give you mercy. And again I fixed my eyes at your lotus feet, tormented by the agony of disbelief. So this is what a conditioned soul goes through. We're not convinced, don't have that Shraddha. And that Shraddha, development of Shraddha is development of spiritual life. And then he says, now I beg you, Srila Prabhupada, to allow me to serve your disciples and so on. So, Srila Prabhupada carried that kind of a conviction, and he presented this with conviction, and he wanted us also to develop that kind of a conviction about these truths given in the Vedic literatures. This is not some kind of fiction, this is fact. We'll stop here. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki.